Okay, good. So week 2 of our book club, reading Scott Oliphint's Reasons for Faith. This week we've read the epistemology section of the book, so section 2 of 4. Right, okay, so did you, I don't know how you want to do this, do you have any burning desire to say anything about this?
Well, right. So it kind of has a few different themes running throughout. In where it starts.
Hold on, sorry. Fuck. We've got it coming through on the live stream. Bastard.
What's going on?
Fuck, do I get rid of that? Ah! Where the fuck's that coming from? Let me mute myself.
Okay. You should be able to mute yourself. There we go. Okay, so the first sort of thing that was going on was this discussion of the doctrine of analogy. It's a medieval doctrine that is taken up by a variety of medieval theologians, and it's one that is sort of near and dear to my heart because it's what I wrote my master's thesis on. So the idea here is that for a variety of different kinds of reasons, the words that we're ordinarily used to using to describe things are not the same sort of words that we should use to describe God. Instead, we can only describe God by way of analogy. But then there's different ways that different theologians want to cash out this concept of analogy. So for Oliphint, there are two that he attributes to Aquinas. One is Aquinas' sort of settled view, and the other is an earlier view. But regardless, the two that he attributes to Aquinas are the doctrine of proportionality, or, sorry, the analogy of proportionality, and then also the analogy of proper attribution. And the analogy of proportionality, that's the kinds of analogies that we're used to from our SATs, where you have, say, glove is to hand as boot is to foot. And the idea here is that we know one half of this structure, so we know what it means to say that we know what it means to say that Alex is good. We don't know what it means to say that God is good, but we know that whatever the relationship is between Alex and goodness is somehow similar to the relationship between God and God's goodness. The analogy of proper attribution, I think he called it, the idea there was that effects can be similar to their causes, so that we say that medicine is healthy, not because medicine is intrinsically healthy, but because medicine causes people to be healthy. And so likewise, there's going to be this relationship between God as the original exemplar of a variety of properties like goodness, and then creatures who have those properties secondarily. And again, the idea is going to be that we don't know what it means to say that God is good, but we know what it means to say that creatures are good, and so that's supposed to give us somehow partial knowledge of what it means to say that God is good.
So this is the so he ends up saying that for Aquinas, I think he says that for Aquinas the kind of original meaning of the term goodness is to God rather than the creaturely one.
Yeah, and Aquinas says that as well. That's an accurate reading of Aquinas.
Yeah, okay, but so then, yeah, and so it sort of made me realize that it's bringing 20th century analytic philosophy a bit more into focus for me. I've only really had a passing acquaintance with figures like Aquinas, but if you take someone like Wittgenstein, like later Wittgenstein, he engages with Augustine, at least in the beginning of that, and proposes a view which is quite different now to, well, it's different to Augustine's view. It also seems like it's quite different to this sort of traditional view that we've inherited through these early church fathers on things like signification or whatever. So the idea of the primary signification of the term being to God, and it's only the secondary kind of deviation, meaning being the one that we attribute to other things. He's kind of flipping that around, right? So that there really is only the meaning that we're giving to one another or something. It's like they're trying to reify it, having this more.
Right. Though, and in some sense that makes more sense, right? I mean, it's
Yeah.
We don't have. I mean, even on the picture provided by the medieval philosophers, we don't have access to what these terms mean in their original signification. So, in some sense, for everyday life or for creaturely affairs, the original signification of the terms is irrelevant. Because we don't have epistemic access to it. It's almost, this is sort of anachronistic, but it's almost like this distinction in Kant between the noumenal realm and the phenomenal realm, right? So we have access to all of the terms as they're used in the phenomenal realm, but God, off in the noumenal realm, we don't have access to that, at least in the present life. Aquinas seems to think that we will have access to those terms in the next life when we have the beatific vision and then perceive God and God's essence. Though even there, Aquinas considers various sorts of problems about how that's going to be possible, because one of the reasons that Aquinas brings us up in the first place is that we have finite minds, and God is an infinite being. And what Aquinas seems to mean by infinite is not just that it's like goodness without limit or something like this, but rather that there's some sort of categorical difference between the creaturely realm and the divine realm, and that's not going to change in the next life. So one of the questions that Aquinas considers and tries to provide an answer to, though I don't think his answer is very convincing, is how it is that even in God's presence we would somehow be able to perceive God. It seems like on Aquinas' view, what he should say, when he tries to resist saying, is that even in God's presence we wouldn't have the ability to really perceive God. And for some early modern atheists, like Dolbach, they actually claim that that's right, that we cannot. That one of the reasons that Dolbach gives for his atheism is that because of this categorical divide between the finite and the infinite, we can't actually talk about the divine or understand what it is that we're saying when we try to do so.
Right. But so just to, I think we should try and stick to the content of what Oliphant's saying in this.
Right. Well, Oliphant brings
chapter.
up this point, right? So Oliphant, this is the reason why Oliphant rejects Aquinas' view on analogy, and why it is that Oliphant introduces his analogy of revelation as a kind of replacement.
Whereabouts is this then? Obviously, we can't do page numbers, but can you tell me the subsection where he makes these points?
Crap. I don't know where I put my. Well, anyway. Oh, there it is.
Okay, good. It does help for a book club if you actually have the book with you.
Right. I knew I had it on my desk because I have a million books on my desk, so it's.
So the first bit of epistemology is called Knowing God's Knowing.
Well, I think it's in chapter 6.
Okay, so that's chapter 5. So let's get to chapter 6.
Maybe it's in chapter 5. Oh, wait, I made a note of it here. Yeah, this seems to be towards the end of chapter 5. That he brings up this problem that the so he says, for example, if we cannot determine in what way or in any way, what goodness is when predicated of God compared to its predication of creatures, how can we posit any kind of analogy at all? On what basis can analogy rest?
Let me just find that bit then. Okay, yeah.
And so the idea here is that so he goes through several different medieval conceptions of analogy, but especially those from Aquinas, and it actually, in some sense, Oliphint is unfair to Aquinas because he says, for example, an analogical term is a species of equivocity rather than univocity. And that's not right, not for Aquinas. For Aquinas very famously says that analogy is a kind of a medium path, a middle road between univocity and equivocity. That's in some sense the entire point of Aquinas, is that he's trying to avoid the extremes of univocity or equivocity. Nonetheless, a number of folks have argued, I think convincingly, and I've argued, that analogy, that Aquinas is unable to carve out a middle path between equivocity and univocity, that ultimately analogy reduces to equivocity, that's what the problem with analogy is that if you have equivocal predication, what that means is that you can't actually talk about God at all because your terms will mean something fundamentally different and unrelated to what your terms meant when they applied to creatures.
Yeah, okay, so let's just spell out. So this distinction is univocal predication is when you say that something is good and you say that God is good, you literally mean exactly the same thing.
Right. God might be a really big good thing, might be very, very good. Or
right.
But it's not a different word, right? It doesn't have a different meaning.
Right. And then equivocal meaning would be there's like at least two senses of good. So you mean an entirely different thing by good when you're talking about God's goodness as opposed to some other thing like my goodness or your goodness or something.
Right. So the example here is like, so the word blue is equivocal. So if I said that I was feeling blue, or if I said the sky was blue, the word blue there doesn't mean at all. The meaning is not even connected between the two uses.
Right. And Aquinas's idea is that you can sort of have the best of both worlds, right, with the analogy.
Right. So it's a different sense of the word, but they're not unrelated senses.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Right. So God's goodness is, or I suppose that our sense of goodness is like the true goodness, which is God's.
Right.
So there's an analogy there between when I say good, well, when I attribute goodness to something creaturely and when I attribute goodness to God, there's an analogy. That something between those two attributions is the same, but something's different, right? So it's neither equivocal nor univocal. And the basic objection that we have with that is something along the lines of saying, but what is the bit that's similar between those two? Like, okay, so there's something the same, there's something different. What is the thing that's the same? And, well, I mean, I don't know how, if you probably say it more sophisticated, but my general thought with that is if you could spell out what that thing was that was the same between the goodness in those two cases, then it would essentially be back to just being a univocal ascription again, right?
Well, yeah, so something like that. So, the way that Roger White puts this in his book, talking about God, he says, look, when you have those four-term analogies, the analogy of proportionality, when you see that on the SATs, one of the things that allows you to solve for an unknown, right? So if I said gloves are to feet as what is to, or gloves are to hands as what are to feet, you can fill in the unknown because you have enough information to do so. But the problem with doing this theologically is that you don't know what God is. You don't know what goodness means when applied to God. So you have one equation and two unknowns. And you don't know either the linking relationship that links from one half to the other half, right? So the thing is just massively underdetermined.
Right, and so I mean, in the SAT case, you could, if pressed, say something like, well, what they have in common is that they're like bits of clothing that fit around those particular body parts or something, right?
Right,
Like,
and we can
that's
also
what they have in common with each other. And
they also have like common cultural associations, right?
okay,
So,
well, whatever, yeah. So let's just
yeah.
say that there's something you could identify, and you could say, or if somebody asked you the question, what is it that gloves and shoes have in common with each other, or something like that, then you could answer that question. But if somebody said to you, what is it that the goodness of God has and the goodness attributed to, the goodness attributed to God and goodness attributed to creatures, well, what is it that why do we think that those are in any sense the same and not totally equivocal? It seems to me, if you could answer that question, then, well, does Aquinas think that you could answer that question and spell out what it is about goodness that applies in both cases?
As far as I can tell. I mean, so folks like Roger White and Anthony Kenny have, and in fact, for Kenny, man, you brought up Wittgenstein before, so I don't know if you've ever read Kenny. But he was a very famous Wittgenstein scholar and a very famous medievalist, and he was also an agnostic. And the reason that Kenny was an agnostic in part was because he thought this problem was unsolvable. He thought that, on the one hand, the medievals were right about these problems with religious language, but on the other hand, that there was no way to actually solve them, and so therefore he thought that this was an argument to sort of suspend belief in God altogether because we don't know what it is we're saying when we talk about God.
Okay. So what's Oliphant's solution to this then? He suggests that Aquinas' view doesn't work, but he has his own view.
It's analogy of revelation, or he calls it analogia revolutionis, or something like that. And it's supposed to be, from what I can gather, that God reveals to us how to speak about God. And I mean, I don't see this solves the problem on the one hand, and on the other, it's not a solution that like the medievals wouldn't have thought of. Like Aquinas said that however the Bible speaks about God is going to be the right way to speak about God, but the problem for Aquinas is to give content to that.
Right, and so this is section 6, chapter 6, I suppose. God speaking of God, right? That's what this is. So let's see. Blah blah blah. Aquinas analogy. I want to know what he says. Do you have a reference for it where he spells out his view? You really should be more prepared.
I should have written that down. Well, so for instance, he says, could it be that one's knowledge of the difference between God and his creation could serve as the presupposition behind everything else? Such
right.
Relationship is the fundamental and primary interpretive grid through which everything else must come, which is sort of the central presuppositionalist claim.
Yeah, okay, good. So this is where he talks about Paul in Romans.
Right.
Right. Okay, good. So I did actually want to focus on this bit a little bit. So he and there's a really bizarre reference to Russell, which I thought was almost certainly just a way of saying, "Oh, I can quote an atheist philosopher for my purposes." So there were two bits. So he brings up a chapter of problems of philosophy called knowledge by acquaintance and knowledge by description, which is obviously a distinction first brought in On Denoting, where Russell is saying he's making a distinction between knowledge where you've knowledge by acquaintance, where you've kind of had some sensory interaction with something. His idea of what counts as being acquainted with something changes over his career, so it's quite difficult to pin it down. It starts off with being when you've met something directly. And he has a realist theory of perception at the time, so he thinks that the object itself is the object of perception. So you can be acquainted with something directly in that sense. But then later on in his career, he holds a sense data view instead. So knowledge by acquaintance really means having sense data that corresponds to something. So if you, well, really, you're really only acquainted with the sense data itself. It becomes kind of solipsistic in a way. But he thinks that you can escape this kind of solipsistic bubble by also having knowledge by description, where you can say something like the teacher of Plato or something, and have knowledge, or you can at least refer to things in that sense, and you can have knowledge about them as well. Anyway, so that's the distinction that he brings up, and he's really only talking about acquainted knowledge, where he says, he quotes Russell, "I say that I'm acquainted with an object when I have a direct cognitive relation to that object, i.e. when I'm directly aware of the object itself. When I speak of a cognitive relation here, I do not mean the sort of relation that constitutes judgment, but the sort which constitutes presentation." And then he goes on, the main consideration is undoubtedly to be derived from remembering what presence actually is. When an object is in my present experience, then I'm acquainted with it. And it's not necessary for me to reflect upon my experience or to observe that the object or the property belonging to my experience in order to be acquainted with it. But on the contrary, the object itself is known to me without any need of reflection on my part as to its properties or relations. Okay, that's what Russell is saying, but you have to bear in mind that really the object that he's being acquainted with is sense data itself. It's just some kind of impression of like blueness and roundness or whatever that's going on.
Whereas I don't think that's what Oliphint wants. I think Oliphint
not at all.
is much more substantive than that. He thinks that we can have immediate acquaintance with the objects in the world, almost like some early modern philosophers thought, or even pre-modern philosophers thought, and that it's through this like direct acquaintance with things in the world that we come to knowledge of God, because the objects in the world derivatively depend upon God for their being, and this is supposed to entail for Oliphint and for Van Til, who says the same thing, that that contained in the idea of the object is somehow the idea of God.
I thought that he was saying that what's maddening about this is that the quote ends with no discussion at all about what the significance is and how it's supposed to be.
Right, yeah, that's right.
All of that stuff I just read out, and then it just goes, second, Paul also wants to make the point that, blah, what you're talking about Paul now? You've just quoted like 2 pages of Russell, and you're not even going to make any comments about what that... So I actually think, but obviously he could mean anything as he doesn't tell us what he means. I think what he means is that he's making room for the idea that you could just know God directly. You just have a direct acquaintance with God, and that's it. It's not so much he's not sketching out a realist theory of perception.
Well, I thought the idea it's not that we have a direct idea of God, but rather that we have a direct idea of objects in the world, but that objects in the world have this important relationship between themselves and God.
But then that makes an indirect. So you're going from knowledge of objects to knowledge of God. But
hang on. On the prior page, he says, the point he, that is Paul, is laboring to set forth is that all people are without excuse before God, because God has made himself known and has been clearly seen and understood through all the things that are made.
Yeah, right.
So I take it that what he's saying is that we have immediate awareness of the objects in the world, and in the act of having immediate access to those objects, we also have immediate access to God, but it's only because we have access to the things God has made. So I've said elsewhere, like in the panel discussion that we did, that presuppositionalists deny Descartes' cogito, the Descartes' I think, therefore I am. And the reason why they do this, I went back and looked this up in both Van Til and Bahnsen, and it came up in the footnotes of this reading, is that for these folks, that sentence, I think, therefore I am, contains within it God already, because I, as a created thing, have this derivative relationship to God, and somehow contained in the concept of I is also the concept of God. So you could no more have the concept of me, or I could no more have the concept of myself than I could have the concept of without having the concept of God, then someone could have the concept of a bachelor without having the concept of an unmarried male, right? So there's supposed to be this kind of conceptual relationship between all other ideas and God as the ultimate source of all of those ideas.
Hold on, how is that? That doesn't seem to run counter to the cogito, though, right? I mean, I think therefore I am presupposes God. That's what it seems that you're saying there.
Yeah, it's right.
Countering cogito.
Well, that knowledge of God is somehow prior to. So Bahnsen says that knowledge of God is prior to knowledge of the self. Van Til says that knowledge of the self and knowledge of God come in the same act. And I take it that what that's supposed to mean is that they come simultaneously. Whereas in Descartes, what happens is that he first proves the existence of the self from the fact that he's thinking about these questions at all, and later on in the meditations, proves or attempts to prove God's existence by appealing to things like the ontological argument and so on.
Yeah. Okay. So there's like. So what they're saying is not just that, because you might say, well, surely you have to, it doesn't matter which step you take in your argument first. Like maybe I reason first using the cogito, and then I prove God through whatever it is, perfections or however it is that Descartes does it. You could sort of reason it in that step, but still hold, well, now that I've got to the end of my deduction, I can see that ontologically God is the first thing or whatever that everything else.
Well, it's not just an ontological distinction.
Yeah, right, exactly. It's kind of subtle, isn't it? But the presuppositionalist is saying something like, it's not a methodological thing, and then you realize that God is more fundamental. It's that really you couldn't know anything. You couldn't even start off the meditative doubts about what exists or not without knowing that God exists, right? I mean, it's like in every, it's in every aspect of everything that you do. It's really weird. It's like a cult, isn't it? Because it insists that it gets injected into every single thing altogether.
That's right.
It's really kind of, and it's weird on Bible Thumping Wingnut. Afterwards, I got into some kind of disagreement with this guy Andrew Rappaport, because he didn't like that I'd said elsewhere that there's this kind of thing that you have to, for presuppositionalism, you have to see God infused in every fact and every, there's no neutral thing that doesn't have God infused within it or whatever. So when you so there's this like radical interpretative element that infects everything, which means that you can't, like, a sort of atheist, someone who professes atheism, and a Christian, i.e. everyone, you can't have a conversation where you agree on anything unless you're open about your starting point or something. Like, it's just like one of you is lying and the other one is telling the truth. It's not just like there's two ways of seeing things. It seems to me that's just a really, really obvious, well, it's not obvious, but it's the kind of most important crux of this whole presuppositionalist idea. I think it's difficult to understand any of it if you don't get that part of it. Would you
Well,
agree with
that's
that?
exactly right. It actually historically preceded the presuppositionalists in two different ways. It precedes them in Abraham Kuyper, who was a Dutch Reformed theologian that Van Til takes a great deal from, who said that everything was connected to everything else. It's a kind of logical holist. But then, importantly, that God is connected with everything else. So that, for example, to deny God's existence is to deny a fact about everything. This is also something that happens in 19th century philosophy more generally, starting with the folks who, I don't know if Hegel himself says this, but the folks who come after Hegel, some of those folks, like the British idealists, some of the British idealists were apparently logical holists. And part of what G.E. Moore does when he is responding to idealism in the early 20th century is to deny that kind of holism and to replace it with logical atomism.
Yeah,
And but they're sitting right in that milieu. So they are. I mean, I've read something that you wrote that you sent me, where you said that, where you sort of compared the logical holists to presuppositionalists. Well, it's not just a comparison; they come directly out of that perspective. That just is.
Right. Yeah. So my point there is that there are there are at least neutral facts, like basic atomic truths or something. I mean, I don't know how committed I am to this view. Like, I don't want to. I could probably be argued out of it, but.
Well, I mean, so I think one thing that's worth looking at is what happens over the history of analytic philosophy. So it begins with folks like Moore and Russell denying idealism and, in the process, denying things like holism. Later on, you have a sort of rebirth of holism with someone like Quine. But one of the things to notice about Quine is that Quine does not think that it's impossible to know a fact in isolation of your acknowledgement of other sorts of facts. So he thinks, so Quine, of course, thinks that our beliefs come in some sort of giant web, so that all of our beliefs are connected to all of our other beliefs. But he doesn't think that in the process, in order to know anything, you'd have to know everything. So one of the things that's important for the presuppositionalists is the thought that in order to know any particular fact, you'd have to know all of the facts, because all of the facts are interrelated. So since only God can know all of the facts, it's our derivative access to God's mind. It's our thinking God's thoughts after God that allows us to think accurate things about the world. But Quine, of course, wouldn't hold anything like that. Quine would just say that our own belief architecture isn't a web, so that all of our beliefs are connected to other beliefs, but that doesn't mean that taking some element of the web, of our own individual web of beliefs, take some node in that web individually, even if the rest of the web is wrong, that doesn't mean that that particular node is wrong. It might be that you have partial knowledge of the world, and that's reflected by some portion of your web being accurate. Yeah, I mean, that whole discussion happens after folks like Van Til, and as far as I know, there isn't the sophisticated presuppositionalists haven't really interacted with this feature of the history of analytic philosophy.
Yeah, right. There's no real. It's like they're always talking about pragmatism, idealism, skepticism, whatever, and there's no, or maybe you get some, sophomoric refutation of logical positivism or something. That's really all it goes. There's no sophisticated mention of Quine or of like Davidson or Putnam or anyone, remotely
even
modern.
Help their view, right? So, one of the things that happens for one of the things that I've noticed is that they a lot of the literature on natural kinds would be very helpful to them. So they think that the reason that there are distinctions that we can draw in the world between different kinds of things, that there are conceptual categories that we can lay down upon the world, is because God has laid down those categories upon the world prior to us. Well, there's this whole discussion of natural kinds that happens in the philosophical literature. Ted Sider's recent book is a example of this literature. But as far as I know, they haven't actually taken up the torch to try to show that this literature about natural kinds is at all helpful to them.
Mm. Well, let's cycle back onto Oliphint, seeing as that's the purpose of this.
Right.
So I found a bit that was kind of interesting, I suppose. I think this is a little bit earlier, so I think I'm going to drag you back to
Okay.
chapter 5, I think.
Okay.
So what I'd seen here was this bit where he's talking about, okay, let me just read this out to you. So he says, blah, 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 blah. Okay, so then there's also this idea anticipated in the Old Testament and realized in the New, that the second person of this three-in-one, while remaining God, took on a human nature and came to this earth and gave up his life for sinful people in order to satisfy the demands of his Father's holiness and justice. This is indeed mysterious. It can be discussed. Terms can be used to help clarify and commend these truths, but just how such things could be remains a mystery for us, although in brackets, although of course not for God. Right now, this type of mystery persists not only in the character of God per se, but also in God's relationship to other things. In many discussions in the philosophy of religion, there's been significant consideration of God to time, our choices, suffering, and to other things as well. These are fascinating discussions which provoke intense debate. Interesting as they are, these notions will not occupy our attention in this chapter. Blah, blah, blah. He says he'll come back to them, but really, the crucial bit was that it can be discussed, but just how these things could be remains a mystery for us. And so I was thinking, like, well, I mean, okay, so think about two types of mystery, right? Say take a crime scene or something, or take something like Madeleine McCann, right? That was a big story over here in the UK. Was that a thing? No, okay. So it's a little girl who went missing, basically. Unsolved crime. No one knows what happened. It was in the newspapers loads. I don't know why. It was really popular. Well, popular. It was really like there was a lot of interest, media interest going into it. And for years, her parents were on TV and stuff, and no one knows what's happened. And so you could say, in a sense, it's a mystery. What happened to this little girl? Where did she go? What happened to her? Were the parents to blame? Did someone come and take her? Whatever. You see all these conspiracy theories on the internet. Is it aliens? It could be anyone, right? So it's a mystery. But really, it's an epistemological mystery. The status of it is epistemological because we just don't know. Nobody knows. Well, maybe somebody knows. But in general, the collective us don't know what happened there. So you could say it's a mystery. But there is something that happened. Right? It's not what you might call an ontological mystery. Like, there is an explanation for it. And it's just that you don't know what it is. But Oliphint seems to be saying with these things, like the relationship of the parts in Trinity or whatever, the specific thing it was that he's talking about there. Not that it's an epistemological mystery, something which we just need to figure out, get some more knowledge on, and we'll understand it or something. He seems to be making the case for it being an ontological mystery, like the relationship, this godly relationship, is inherently mysterious, and there's nothing you could do to try and understand it. It's an end point over which reason can't pass. You can't make any progress to understand it. And I found that concept itself to be quite peculiar. The more you think about it, the more bizarre it is to postulate an ontological mystery. I mean, because for one thing, how can you tell? I mean, maybe Madeleine McCann's disappearance is an ontological mystery. Maybe some like weird vortex of like indeterminacy came in, and there is no answer to what happened, right? It's just sort of a rupture in space-time continuum, and all sorts of like weird stuff happened. Maybe that's what happened, right? But how could you tell between an epistemological mystery, and how could you ever clear it up and say, oh no, it's not an epistemological mystery, it's an ontological mystery? Because in a sense, you'd have to know that it was. You know what I mean? Like I think it's an incoherent idea.
The usual way of cashing out mysteries in Christian theology is to say something like this. Is to say that there are various things that we know by way of reason. There are even various sorts of things that we don't know by way of reason that are revealed to us by God, and they, but which we can comprehend by way of reason. So there's various parts of the Bible, for instance, that maybe no one would have known otherwise, and yet they're perfectly comprehensible. But mysteries are supposed to be things which are revealed by God, and which remain inaccessible to reason, and yet which we are supposed to, which we are obliged to, be obligated to affirm, precisely because there are various sorts of bits of doctrine that we're obligated to affirm. Now, the picture for the presuppositionalists is going to be a little bit different, because in some sense they think that everything is a revelation from God, right? So everything that we know is revealed to us in some sense by God. So they don't have this. They don't have the usual sort of distinction between natural revelation and scriptural revelation, or special revelation. But there's still going to be this this idea that there are truths that we are obliged to affirm because God has willed for us to affirm them, and yet which we cannot, by our finite powers of reason, comprehend.
Right. But okay, so let me put the problem like this then. So there's this, I don't know, with the Trinity in particular, I read something about how there's very few passages in the Bible that literally say the idea of the Trinity, right? It's kind of a later development in the church, but
yeah, it's supposed to be an inference, the best explanation, or something like this.
Right. But there are one or two passages, and I'd heard that these could easily have been added in by Erasmus in like 1550 or whatever. You know, at some point he literally is like the only guy in Western Christendom educated enough to undertake the task of translating from the original Greek or something into contemporary academic Latin or something like this. And he, it's a bit of a conspiracy theory, of course, but the idea is that he, under pressure from someone, king or whatever, inserts a couple of lines that are the dogma that they all believe in his particular faction or whatever, right? So the idea, anyway, it's a bit like in Salman Rushdie's, damn it, what was that book that he got in trouble for writing?
Organic Verses.
Yeah, right. It's in that book. It's this similar thing with the guys reading out or writing down what Muhammad tells him, but then he deliberately changes it and reads it back, and Muhammad doesn't know, so he decides he's going to sculpt all the doctrine his way, whatever. Anyway, so the point is that there's this. So imagine you've got these potential worries, right? Is this book reliable, or has it got these things in it that somebody's messed with, right? And how do I know that I can trust this source? And one way of thinking about it would be, you'd say, well, I could interrogate it with reason. I mean, and it might be that someone's like made a mistake with the translation, or they've added in an idea that's incoherent or something, but you might think, well, the true message of God would make perfect sense. I mean, kind of like at least a necessary, though maybe not sufficient, condition of the message in the Bible would be that it would be rationally comprehensible, right? So if there was any kind of purported mystery, you'd think this must be an epistemological mystery, because the true message of God would be rationally discoverable or something, and that would be a method of weeding out these things. But they're going to go against that by saying, in principle, no, whatever it says, we have to believe it anyway. But that leaves you kind of incredibly vulnerable to the potential corruption that, like, I don't know how they would say this story about Erasmus adding in this thing or whatever. Like, how do they know that didn't happen? I mean,
well, this is one of the reasons why in the history of Christian theology fundamentalists lost out. So one of the things that happens in the early 20th century is that, you know, this faction of folks shows up that says, the fundamentalists, who say in part that we have to reject these newfangled interpretations of the Bible as a historical document because we have to believe the Bible is free of any errors and that it's literally true. But, well, you know, one of the responses was, well, you know, we have thousands upon thousands of copies of the Bible from the course of history, and one of the things that we can do is we can track the way that it was changed over time. Sometimes in very small ways, and sometimes in very major ways. Sometimes those changes are even written in the into newer translations of the Bible now, especially when they're major additions. So, for instance, one of the really big ones was, you know, the story about he who is without sin shall cast the first stone. Right, when they bring the woman before Jesus and he refuses to let them stone her to death. That story appears to have been added around the year 1000. So the response from the fundamentalists was to say, oh, no, you see, you're right that it was changed later on, but two things. When we say that it's free of error and that it's literally true, we mean the original copies of the text, which of course is very convenient to say because we don't have those. Right? The earliest ones we have are a few hundred years after that. The other thing they said was that you're right that changes have been made to the text, but everything occurs through God's providence. So whatever changes have happened to the text was always through God's providence, so that God has ensured that we have the copy of the Bible that God would want us to have.
But that entails that then previous generations had a wrong copy, or there's two different ones and they're both right. Okay, so it's relative then. What's
apparently? I mean, the Catholic Church says the same thing, right? So the Catholic Church, something called apostolic succession, where they say that the proper truths of Christianity can be communicated to us by Mother Church because it's the Church is established by Simon Peter that has been able to pass down from generation to generation the proper truths. Of course, if you go back and look at Catholic history, you find all of this war about, you know, all these conflicts about different kinds of doctrines and dogmas and so forth and so on. And so it's difficult to really cash out what it means when one talks about apostolic succession. But it's a really similar idea, that somehow through God's providence, God has ensured that we have the materials that God wants to have. And the proper way to interpret them according to the fundamentalists would be that the Holy Spirit guides our interpretation of the Bible.
Okay, that's another convenient. There's loads of convenient things in this. Like so there's this doctrine of the Trinity, and although I mean, in fairness, he does go on later to say some more stuff about it, which is what I'm looking forward to more. Is next week's, because we're going to start getting into this stuff.
Right.
But well, in general, the tactic of saying, or look, you know, if you say, I don't get this Trinity stuff, right? How can it be three people but one person? How, you know, does that mean that if God is, or if the Son is God and God is the Father, does that mean that the Son is the Father? Because that seems like it's a contradiction. How can that doesn't make sense or whatever? And you know, but but it's a mystery, right? It's a response back. It's just a mystery. Hey, it's a mystery, right? It's so convenient, and it's so on the one hand, like it's so convenient that it's just like there's no possible way of determining whether it is a mystery. I think I can't see how you could actually ever get to the point of kind of confirming that it's actually a mystery and not just an incoherent idea. Right? It's like distinguishing between those two things seems to be completely impossible. Right? But also, secondly, it's like it's totally anti-scientific. It's totally anti-discovery or curiosity in general, right? Because, I mean, if science got to the point where they say, oh, I don't know, there's this like black body radiation or whatever, it's a mystery, let's not bother investigating. There'd be no quantum mechanics, right? There would be no development in science whatsoever. So you should. I mean, I'm not saying that I know that there are no ontological mysteries. Or how could you know one way or the other about them? But you should have the working principle that when you come across something that's a mystery, try and assume that it's not that you could figure it out. I mean, that's got to be your working principle. And these guys are saying, abandon that working principle. Just, hang your head in ignorance and just be happy with that, because that's the appropriate way to be.
The kind of the Kantian distinction between the noumenal and the phenomenal realms, right? So it's almost as if what they're saying is that there is some denizen of the noumenal realm that is God, who's able to communicate to us aspects of the noumenal realm. Now, if you're Kant, and someone presents that to you, what are you going to say? You're going to say, first of all, that whatever they say to us, we're going to find totally incoherent, right? Like, anything delivered from the noumenal realm, directly from the noumenal realm, is probably going to look like gibberish to us. And then second, that unaided human reason is only able to interrogate the phenomenal realm on Kant's view. So if you have a view like that about the world, I mean, and I don't think that the Kantian view is antithetical to science. So I'm not entirely.
The Kantian view would say that science goes on in the empirical realm anyway. It's not scientific theories don't necessarily tell you anything about the noumenal realm.
Well, that's right, and I think that that's the same thing that these folks could say, right, or that a theologian could say. That the theologian could say, look, what science investigates is the empirical, phenomenal realm. God is a aspect of the world that is beyond that realm. In fact, Van Til even says this. He says that this is why Van Til denies a variety of traditional arguments that have been offered for God's existence. He says that all empirical arguments could ever give you are aspects of the of the creaturely realm, but God is beyond the creaturely realm.
Yeah, but so this is a different thing though, because it's not the same as saying, yeah, okay. So on the one hand, yeah, there is something kind of similar about the idea of the noumenal realm being beyond your ability to know it as a creature or as a as a knower in general. Right? Okay. So in a sense, the noumenal realm for Kant is a mystery. Right, but that's not the same as this type of mystery, because so it could be that God is Unitarian, right, and not Trinitarian, and yet it's because it's a noumenal fact, not a phenomenal fact. You could never actually know that, but it wouldn't be an ontological mystery. His nature, it would be kind of quite easy to understand if only you could get access to the noumenal realm, which for epistemological reasons you can't. So it would be an epistemological mystery to you, but it wouldn't be an ontological mystery. Whereas with this, they're saying it is like this in the noumenal realm. Somehow they know. God tells me that it's like this, right? But it doesn't make sense. It's a mystery. It's, if you try and understand its relationships, interrelationships between the parts or whatever, like, it's a mystery, and that's why you won't be able to understand it. So I mean, compare it to the Unitarian God, where they're saying, can't actually know it, at least unless God tells you about it, right? So it's mysterious in a sense. But if he did tell you about it, it would be easy to understand, because it's just this one guy standing there behind the veil of perceptions or whatever, and he's like one thing. Thing is, on their picture, they're saying it's kind of three and kind of one, and the way in which that works is a mystery. It doesn't really, there is no explanation that you're ever going to get out of it. So I think it's more than just saying that it's in the noumenal realm. And I'm just very, very skeptical about the idea of an ontological mystery. I mean,
there was something Wittgenstein said about, if a lion could talk, you wouldn't understand them, or something like this. That was Wittgenstein, right?
Yeah.
And I kind of have the same idea in mind here, that if you could have access to the noumenal realm, you wouldn't understand what you're looking at.
I don't see that follows from Kant, because, I mean, as far as I understand it,
because all of our language is developed to talk about the phenomenal realm, right?
Right, so, right. But it could be that you map it by accident, and so the synthetic a priori structures that you have might actually correspond to the noumenal realm. There's nothing to say that it isn't like that. It's very unlikely, of course, right? But who's to say that it isn't? There's nothing to say that. It might not be any different from the phenomenal realms, but it's absolutely possible that that's the way that things are, right? And so that makes it different to this you know, what they're saying is on the other side, there's this kind of like weird shifting, not really anyone, like it's kind of in the nature of the Trinity is sort of ontologically indeterminate. You can't fit it into any determinate scheme of things. I mean, and that means that it's, you know, I just don't see that the noumenal realm has to be like that. It might be like that because you don't know what it's like, but it could be completely straightforward. It might be very, very easy to understand if only you could, you know, somehow get through this epistemological limitation that you have. It's like, it seems to me that on their view, even God couldn't understand the nature of the Trinity because it's an ontological mystery. So it doesn't have any kind of resolution to it.
I think a better way to attack this might be to say something like this. It might be to say, look, this is sort of similar but different in some respects. So there's a philosopher around now whose podcast I listen to named Dale Tuggy, maybe it's Tuggy or something. Anyway, he argues for what he calls biblical unitarianism. So the view is that the best explanation of various passages in the Bible is that God is not this 3-in-1 Trinitarian thing, but rather that the Father is God, and that there's a sense in which the Son is divine but is not God. And so now he is an evangelical Christian, and he thinks the Bible is the inerrant word of God. So on the one hand, we have Tuggy or Tuggy, whatever his name is, arguing that the Unitarian God is the best explanation of the biblical passages once one is accepted that the Bible is the truth. And on the other hand, you have these folks who just declare, right, like that it's Trinitarian, and it's, if you go back into church history, the way in which people figured this out was by an inference to the best explanation. So the conversation that Tuggy is in a conversation where you figure out what God is like by virtue of a best explanation based upon the biblical text. And somehow the presuppositionalists claims people to do something else, but it's not clear what it is that you do. You can't do what they claim to do, which is to start just from a self-evident reading of the text, because there is no self-evident reading of the text. You have to infer the Trinity. You can't, somehow glean it as God given in the pages of the book, because it's just not there.
Well, I think that, I'm going to see if I can do a quick Google search for it. I imagine there must be passages in the Bible that mention the Trinity.
There are passages in the Bible which some people interpret as mentioning the Trinity, and other passages which don't. And folks who are biblical Unitarians are very careful to cash out their views in a lot of rigor, but whatever the argument is going to be, you can't just. The argument structure is going to be an inference, the best explanation. It's going to say.
Okay, so take this then. 1 John 5:7-8, and it says, this is King James, obviously, but it says, "For there are 3 that bear record in heaven: the Father, the Word, and the Holy Ghost, and these 3 are one." I don't know. There are things where they'll probably say, "Look, I'm not stretching it. It's saying there's 3 and they're one."
So they could be right. So there's different ways to say that they're one. For example, you could say, for example, they are united in will.
Yeah, that's fair enough, I suppose. Yeah.
And then plenty of theologians have said, plenty of Unitarian theologians have made the claim that God is one in will, but not one in substance. So the traditional way to cash out.
Yeah, is that monophysitism or something?
Oh, I don't remember those are the exact names of the.
Anyway, yeah.
But for instance, the Jehovah's Witnesses. The Jehovah's Witnesses claim that the pre-incarnate Jesus was one of the archangels. I think Michael, and then was, exalted to the status of divinity, and but that the Son and the Father are united in will, even though they're not united in substance.
Okay, well, okay, good. So we're going to look at knowing, having read ahead, knowing that Oliphint's going to address this, and it'll be fun looking at the way he addresses it. Well, many of the things he says about it may best be described as ontological mysteries themselves. So we'll have to read through them to determine whether or not they are. We'll see. Let's just.
What else do we want to say about what we read?
Sorry?
What else do we want to say about what we read?
Yeah, well, there was another. So I suppose slightly following on from this mysteries thing, there was another bit that drew my attention and made me think of linking them together in some way. So slightly further on from that, he says, the fact that God is truth, therefore, according to the Christian tradition, does not mean that God participates in the property of truth that lies in eternity or exists eternally with or alongside him. Rather, as God, he simply is truth, and the truth that he is just is himself. Okay, so it's kind of a weird sentence on its own to say, but so obviously the first thing to say about it is that there is some kind of like category mistake by simply saying God is truth, right? Because I mean, what does that mean? So like when, because you've got to, yeah. So okay, so there's a lot of things I need to just try and like clear out of my brain, but like there are these questions and worries about like ontological mysteries, right? And I think that it's similar to this is that there's these potentially historically accidental sayings and phrases, possibly inserted, possibly translated differently, possibly said for rhetorical effect, possibly interpreted for whatever person's agenda or whatever. Things like the Trinity and things like this doctrine of, Jesus says to Pilate, is it that he says that he is the truth?
Yeah.
Is that right? And he says, I am the light, the truth, and the way, and there's some other bit, whatever.
Only go through the Father through him, and so on.
Right. But the idea of ascribing to a person the property of truth, you've got to think about like going back to univocal and equivocal ascriptions here. Truth, generally speaking, is the property of things that you say. You say of somebody, what he said was true, right? You don't say that person was true, right? You might say that person is truthful, by which you mean that most, or indeed most of the important things that they say turn out to have been true things, but you're ascribing truth to the things that they say. And if you're a philosopher about it, you'll make a distinction between the things that they say and the propositions that the things that they say express. And you might say that the propositions are the things that have truth. But yeah. I don't see anyone. Well, I mean, I'm not just saying it because philosophers don't say it, then it doesn't make sense. But like, what does it mean to say alongside this property of truth that seems to be an everyday one, you kind of garden variety of like theory of truth, alongside that one where it's ascribing it to sentences or propositions or something, there's another sense in which you can say that somebody is true, right? That this person is true. What does that mean? I mean, is it a shortcut for saying that most of the things they say are true? I mean, to say that God is truth. I mean, it's one thing to say that God is good. I mean, okay, fair enough. But I suppose what you mean is that like he does good things all the time. But to say that he is truth, does that just mean that he always speaks the truth? Otherwise, I literally don't know what that means. I think it's meaningless.
So first I want to talk about the God is good bit, because what you said is quite true for what his conception is going to be. So Oliphint signs up for another medieval doctrine called the doctrine of simplicity, which says that God is numerically identical to all of God's properties.
Well, I'm not sure that that's how he always says it. We've been listening to some of his lectures recently where he says the doctrine of divine simplicity means that God has no parts, which I found
well,
weird
right.
in its own sense. But
That is taken to be, yeah. So those are both the same thing. So in other words, if you could subdivide God in terms of God's properties, then you could subdivide God into parts. But God does not have parts, and God cannot be subdivided in terms of God's properties. And so therefore God is going to be identical to God's properties. So when they say that God is good, they don't just mean that God is the property of goodness. They mean that God is identical to goodness. It's as if God was identical to like the Platonic form of goodness. And so likewise here with truth, the idea is going to be that God is somehow identical to the Platonic form, or they're not Platonists, so they wouldn't quite say it that way, but that God is identical to something like the Platonic form of truth. Truth is another property, and God is identical to that property. Yeah, now I agree with you that I have no idea what that means to say that God is identical to truth. I mean, I mean, I don't know what it means that God is identical to goodness either, but it seems particularly perplexing to my mind when people use the word truth in this way. But it's not just Oliphint. I've seen, and it's not just theologians that do this. I've seen a variety of people outside of the analytic philosophical tradition who use the word truth in some very strange ways, or at least ways that seem strange from my perspective. So when people talk about things like absolute truth or truth with a capital T, I'm not convinced they always mean like a property of a proposition.
no, I don't. In that sense, no. The truth with a capital T is a bit like Hegel's absolute, I think.
Yes.
Something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. Absolute truth.
I don't know what that's
absolute
like.
Doesn't really.
The way that I sort of tease this out in my brain is that perhaps what people mean when they use phrases like absolute truth, or when a lot of lay people sort of talk casually about truth, what they mean is something like real. And so to say that to talk about the absolute in Hegel's sense is going to be to talk about the way that reality really is, or something like that. But I don't see that really solves. So in some sense, maybe Oliphint is saying that God is real, but of course, of course he would say that. What does that help us with? I mean, he believes in God, but I don't think that.
Yeah. Okay. So there's the worry I had before was that, well, there's this doctrine of the Trinity, which may be an incoherent idea, like your philosopher podcast guy sounds like, of the idea that, well, the use of reason could wheedle out the incoherent doctrines and leave us with the correct ones or something.
Right.
And the worry is that if right, but the worry is that when the use of reason is subjected at all times to the acceptance of these various doctrines, what you find is you get things which maybe looks like a divine mystery, or at least you have to say that it is an ontological mystery, but all it is just a incoherent idea. And here we've got another example, which is that you have to develop a kind of an alternative way of speaking about this type of thing. You have to use truth in a way in which it's not used anywhere else for any other purpose. To ascribe truth to a person, just not done in other contexts that I can think of. I mean, saying the absolute truth or truth with the capital T, even those things are different from this. I mean, in no other context do you ascribe this, right? But it seems to me it may just be a historical accident about, well, Jesus just says, I am the truth. It's a metaphor, and he means something slightly differently, and they're taking it to be the literal truth, so they have to accept it, right? And then you're stuck with this, well, because I'm not going to use reason to question anything in this book. I have to accept all of these things. I have to convolute my brain and turn it into some way in which that makes sense. And, you know, it's like, it's bizarre. So I think there's something that's sort of like danger of putting reason down when you're reading the Bible means that you end up getting stuck in these like weird little kind of intellectual dead ends where it's like you're just chasing around what was quite possibly just a typo or like a kind of, you know, someone inserting it in. It's like, it's not the word of God. It's not, there's nothing significant about it. The fact that it's hard to understand is because it doesn't make any sense, not because it's a profound mystery or whatever, right? I mean, and I just worry that like that's just all that's going on here. It's just a weird, and how could they know? How could you, what's the deciding thing between these two? There's a problem of criteria, and I think ultimately it shows you. Okay, so I think, right, just to step back from what I'm saying and put it into wider perspective, it's probably too early to go here, but because I've been reading Van Til again recently, so I sort of put Oliphint down and been reading other things, but so there's this kind of idea of the final authorities are on one hand scripture and on the other hand something else like autonomous reason or something like this, right? And the Van Tillian kind of thing is that, well, what we have to do is not just sort of shout, oh, I use scripture, or I use reason, because then like what we're doing is we don't even agree on what constitutes the criteria for deciding what's right and what's wrong. So in the face of that, Van Til's supposedly novel suggestion is that we do like the internal critique or whatever, and we jump over into the person's perspective and say, oh yeah, but if you use reason, then, you know, you're stuck with these kind of like circular things and skepticism and blah, 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 and that means it doesn't work. So hop on over into the Christian worldview and we'll show you that everything works properly or whatever. But I mean, I think that what I'm doing right now is kind of an internal critique of the Christian view, because like how, so, but maybe I'm not, maybe I'm still bringing the authority of reason with me, but I'm saying is that like, if you're taking this thing as authoritative, this scripture, you wouldn't know if you were getting it wrong and you were being led down a blind alley, like spending your whole life trying to figure out what it means when Jesus says that he is the truth, the light, the truth, and the way. If you spend your whole time and you say, oh, I can't find, I spend my whole life doing it, it must be a divine mystery. You haven't ruled out the fact that it was in fact just a typo, or it just didn't make any sense at all or something. And like, I guess I think, is it a legitimate way to criticize the use of scripture as an authority, or am I in some way begging the question still against their view? Is it more sophisticated?
One of the things that strikes me as problematic about what they're doing is this appeal to mystery. I think you've stated it really well, that imagine the following. Imagine that the presuppositionalist jumps into the naturalist worldview in order to do an internal critique. And they show that naturalism results in whatever sorts of internal contradictions. And then the naturalist responds, no, you don't understand. These are all mysteries. And you see, it's been revealed to us by nature that this is the way the world is, so we need to accept it as such. I mean, it's like, it's what they're doing is they're sort of illegitimately disallowing the same move to anyone else, and it's mysterious as to talk about a mystery. It's mysterious as to why they never seem to bring this up. That like, if you allow the theologian to appeal to mystery, to explain every single, like, what do they do if you present them with what looks like a contradiction in their view? They say it's a mystery. That just there's various places where they say straight away that just is what you do when presented with a contradiction in Christianity. That whatever the contradictions are, they're not real contradictions. They're only apparent, that they must be mysteries.
Mm-hmm.
Well, okay, but then that means that you can't actually do an internal critique of Christianity.
Mm. Yeah, right. Absolutely. I mean, not to mention the fact that let me just I know this is off-piste a little bit, but I have this right next to me.
Yeah.
I was thinking about this. I think I have the page folded down. Okay, so the indirect apologetical argument is evident on previous pages of this book, even though it's not. It's really unclear what that argument is.
You have to do the Holy Spirit, Alex.
That's right. As has already been indicated in previous analyses and discussions, a believer's worldview can be internally compared with the unbeliever's worldview to see if either one has a cogent theory of knowledge. When we do this, the results are of great apologetic significance, since believers and unbelievers are arguing over what they do and do not know. Within the Christian worldview, knowledge, along with rational empirical methods, can be affirmed and made intelligible. But when we, for argument's sake, look into character and consequences of non-Christian philosophies, we encounter repeated epistemological failure of unbelief. Christianity is therefore epistemologically necessary. That is, it must be true because of the impossibility of the contrary, right? Well, what it seems to me is going on that's really wrong about that whole... So I said, a minute ago, I said maybe what I have done is I haven't left my presuppositions at the door when I jumped into the Christian worldview, because I'm still using reason to try and figure out an argument that shows that you can't use mysteries or something. Like maybe I've begged a question against it and not really doing internal critique. I think what's going on there is that exactly. So that's Banson rather than Van Til that I just quoted. But what he's doing is he's saying, all he's doing is trying to explain Van Til's idea, but he's saying, well, we can jump into each other's worldview and we'll see that only one of them lives up to these standards of like being not impossible, basically. That you can see the impossibility of the contrary means that only this one's possible, and that means that this one is the right one, it passes the test. But the problem is the criteria for impossibility, or what makes a good theory of knowledge, or what counts as an absurd worldview or something, is supposed to be something which isn't, it's like he's bringing that with him when he goes into the other person's worldview. He's saying, look, okay, I'll take on your view. Oh, so everything's material in nature, blah, blah, blah. Well, that's absurd. Eventually you'll get to this point where I say, but look, I've produced this kind of absurdity in your worldview. The thing is, if you go, but in my worldview, that's not absurd. You haven't left all of your presuppositions behind. You'd actually have to think like me. And for me, that's not an absurdity. Even if it was, say, a contradiction. Well, what's wrong with that, though? I mean, okay, I have no theory of knowledge. What's wrong with that? How can you judge it? You have to take all of my views on if you're going to jump into my worldview. Otherwise, it's an external critique still, or it's some kind of partial mix between internal and external. And so the real criteria that are supposed to be doing the legwork here, deciding which worldview is passed and which one's failed, those criteria are not up for debate, and they are...
Well, so...
I mean, right, what counts as a contradiction? That seems to me to be a worldview-specific thing.
Well, I forget where Van Til says this, but he says that... he addresses something that's related. He says that it's not that he applies the principle of non-contradiction because it can be appealed to from some sort of neutral position when evaluating the non-Christian worldviews, but rather it's that in the non-Christian worldviews themselves, the claim is made that one shouldn't have contradictions. But if you think about this, it's like, but wait a minute. There's something very funny about that, right? So if you go into a worldview, and you accept the notion that it ought not have, well, if you go into a worldview and you accept the notion that the worldview ought to have contradictions, and then it's presented within that worldview that one ought not have contradictions, that's hardly a problem, because that would just be another contradiction.
Right.
right? So it's only it's like the way that I would critique this is to say something like this. It's like, look, you actually do have to have some sort of neutral standpoint from which you can say that one ought not have contradictions, or else when you go into a worldview, you don't know whether you should first accept that contradictions are okay, or if you should accept that contradictions are not okay.
Right. Or any other criteria as well. It's not just about the principle of non-contradiction. So let's say you profess to have knowledge about certain things, but when pressed upon your reasons for those beliefs being knowledge, you find that you're unable to justify them sufficiently or something. So say that that's what happens. You kind of have this epistemological failure in your worldview. Now, only if you, why can't you just say, but that's what it's like that's just what knowledge is like. It's the sort of thing where you say that you've got justifications for it, but no one really has them when pressed upon it. Right? That's my theory of knowledge. And then they say, well, how do you then show that that's a failure? Because you can interrogate people, and like Socrates, you can prick their conscience and show that they don't really know anything. But that doesn't count as a failure of epistemological theory on this worldview, because like you define it the way that you want to. It's your worldview. You define it the way that you want to. It's like they're not really saying we're judging it on its own terms. We're just judging it on certain things about it that are up for their worldview to decide, like whether you think that God exists. But then there's certain other things, like very, very traditional standard things about like all the theories really have to be more or less the same as ours. Normal philosophical theories.
Well,
you can't have any of these deviant ones like accepting contradictions or just accepting the constant failure of epistemology or something, and just saying that doesn't, that there's nothing wrong with my worldview. Then most of the time we say if you can derive a contradiction, that means that your theory is faulty in some way. Or if I can show you that your reasons aren't sufficient to support that knowledge claim, then you have to give it up or something. But if you just deny those and say that's not how my worldview works, then I just don't. Because so the point is, anyway, it's not that you can just come up with one that would do it or something. The more general point is that the criteria for deciding what counts as a viable worldview are, it seems to me, not reflected upon, and it's introduced as if you're supposed to start playing the game with all of these rules in play already, and only from that point onwards do we get going. Whereas those things should be up for debate as much as anything else. And how do you debate those things? How do you construct it? You have to be using reason this whole time. You have to be thinking things through. Should I accept contradictions? Well, I don't know. Let's think about it. And yes, of course. It makes it difficult because you're calling into question whether or not showing a contradiction in an argument it counts as does make it very, very difficult to do. But that is still the way that you do it. There's no other way of doing it, because we're talking now outside of worldviews. You can't just say, well, in my worldview, scripture gives me all the answers. And that's fine, but we're talking about whether or not it counts as a criteria for deciding whether a worldview is successful or not. You can't appeal to, in your worldview, what makes a specific claim successful or not. It's like a meta analysis, which they seem to be, well, Banson seems to be blissfully unaware of, which is, he's got a PhD in philosophy. How is he so unreflective on things about the philosophical aspects to this whole program? It's bizarre. I don't know.
Well, I think a better way for them to go, and maybe Oliphint will say this later, but so Oliphint has this view, this really peculiar view that to understand any idea at all is to have the idea of God. Right? So that somehow contained within any idea is the idea of God. And so, this gives something like an ontological argument from anything, right? So from this Virginia Tech subway cup is somehow contained within the idea of this cup is the idea of God. And so we have an ontological argument basically from the cup to God's existence. And the thing that the thing that's really striking, the thing that's really weird about what I've read so far from them is that it would seem to me that they don't even need all this stuff about worldview analysis once you say that, right? Because now it's just, well, who cares if there's these other worldviews? The point is we can prove God's existence from my cup, right? Like, why would I even bother showing these other views are false? They might be internally consistent, but who cares? They fail because they're just not true. I don't know why they don't just say that. I don't know. It's weird to me that that's not doesn't seem to be like an option.
Well, but that requires an argument, which we haven't seen yet, though. I mean, it's one thing to say that you can't have knowledge of the Virginia Tech Starbucks mug or whatever it was without having knowledge of God. It's one thing to say that, but it's another reason. I mean, I can say anything. You know, yeah, I can have knowledge about that without knowledge of God. Okay, well, how do you decide between them? You need to have some kind of argument that shows that the first view is right or not. What's the argument for that? The only argument that I've ever really heard anyone say is the transcendental one. And then when you push on that, it then starts talking about worldviews, because so that's where we get to worldviews. That's why we end up having to get around in that merry-go-round.
Is distinct from the worldview analysis. So in the following way, the transcendental argument is supposed to show that behind our conceptual schemes is God.
Yeah, okay, so the transcendental argument can be stated without it, because you can just say God is a necessary precondition for X, whatever it is, and X, therefore God, right? Okay, that's fine. That's a transcendental argument. Didn't mention the word worldview, but the point is, what supports premise one? Right? Why think that God is the necessary precondition for all of these things? And the only way that you can do that is you have to demonstrate the impossibility of the contrary, right? Which is what we were talking about before. That if Kant says causality is a necessary precondition for intelligibility, and you say, well, why though, Kant? I don't reckon it is. You'd say, well, the argument at least would be something along the lines of, when you try and imagine the world without causality involved, intelligibility drops out as a consequence of that. Like everything becomes a booming, buzzing mass of confusion, or whatever it is he says. So that means that intelligibility is impossible without all of these various forms of
right. Okay. All right.
So, but try and say that same type of impossibility, the contrary argument for God, without bringing in worldviews. That would be the idea.
Got it. Okay. All right.
I mean, no. The thing is that no presupposition is ever given that argument.
Well, but we can sort of, like I've said to you before, it's possible to kind of see what's going on, though. Is that I mean, you said it yourself that there's this contrast between Christian theism and then like autonomy, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so and so Kant is kind of like is often given as like the prototypical example of the autonomous worldview, where we take in like undifferentiated sense data, we make sense of that sense data by laying down our own categories on that sense data, and then at least on some like postmodern interpretations of Kant, we literally construct our own reality, right? By the act of laying down our categories on that sense data is in some sense a constructive act whereby we construct the reality.
Yeah, I think that construction is probably a misleading term for that, because constructivism is like more something that's like, I mean, so the thing is with Kantian categories, it's like digestion. Yes, you are doing it, right, but you're not in control of that in any way. It's not something that you're making yourself, right? Where if I see constructivism being more in the spirit of like Nietzsche, where he's being this whole like we must make our own values, be the artists of our own future, blah blah blah. Where you're trying to say there is no real, or Camus or someone, right? Like you're saying there is no real meaning, but we have to make it for ourselves or something like that.
Right, but postmodern authors like, so my understanding is that postmodern authors like Derrida see themselves as putting forward a kind of neo-Kantian position, even though, like, Kant scholars would disagree with that characterization of Kant. So that
Who says that about Derrida?
I believe Derrida does. Anyway, I mean, I could be wrong about that, but I mean, I watched I can send you a talk that I was watching where that claim is made. But
I mean,
the
I've read a fair amount of Derrida. I don't remember. I mean, he says a lot of crazy stuff, of course. Right? The idea that he would say of his project that it's, in some sense, an inheritor of Kant seems very, very unlikely. I mean, it might be the case, right? Of course, but I mean,
well, at any rate, I think the way that Van Til wants to characterize Kant is
okay.
like
Yeah, let's get back on track. Right. Okay.
the way that Van Til wants to characterize Kant is that Kant is someone who thinks that we as subjects construct the world, so that we have put ourselves in place of God as the folks who are in charge of interpreting the world. Whereas on Van Til's view, what we do is that we reinterpret the world. The world comes pre-interpreted from God, and we assign interpretation to the world, but it's not an original interpretation. It's a reinterpretation.
Yeah. Okay. I see that. It seems like a tenuous way of, because as I said beforehand, that Kant, you don't choose your categories. So in what sense are they autonomous for you? It's like, digestion isn't autonomous, right? It's an unconscious drive that goes on, but the category of causation is closer to digestion than it is to like free choice. I'm not choosing to see the world with causation in place, right? I have to. It's there. So it seems very strange to categorize that as in any sense an autonomous thing, right? Autonomy, it seems to me, is much more like choosing to affirm particular things to be true or false, like whether God exists or whether, gay marriage is wrong or something like this,
Well,
right? You're making your own mind up and you're saying, well, the reason I think that is because I've got my own reasons and I've come to it myself by thinking for myself. And they're saying you should really let God tell you which things to affirm, which things not to affirm.
so my understanding of the way that social constructionism worked in the history of continental philosophy was that first you have like a subjectivist interpretation of Kant, but then it turns into a cultural relativist interpretation of Kant as cultures are put in the place of providing the categories of the understanding. And the way that I'm trying to see Van Til is as taking that kind of view about Kant.
Okay, but look, so just to pause there for a second, even if that was right, okay, so society in place of my psychological makeup or something like that, that's the development from Kant through to the postmodern. So even if that was right, I still don't see how that means, I mean, it's still not up to me, is it? If I'm born into a society where they say that gay marriage is okay and that's why I think that it's okay or something, it's not autonomous. At no stage does that become autonomous. So that can't be the distinction between the Christian worldview, the non-autonomous worldview, and the autonomous one, that God gave us the categories. Because what difference does it make if God gives us the categories and the other guys, they just take the categories that society gives them? On each except what someone else tells you. It's not autonomous in either case.
So, but the question here is, what does autonomy mean for... I guess part of the question here is, what does it mean to be autonomous for Van Til? I take it that, I mean, in various places, he denies... I mean, he's a Calvinist, first of all, so he denies libertarian free will. But then he also, there's various places where it seems like he denies various compatibilist views as well. I don't know, I have a very hard time making sense of this portion of Van Til's ethics, but it seems like when he says autonomy, he means something like explained in terms of the actions of creatures or independent of God. He doesn't
Yeah, independent
necessarily.
of God. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, so I don't think he necessarily means that it's by some free choice of the human will, or at least he doesn't.
Right. I mean, because I was putting it in terms of like individualism or something that you. So I mean, because this fits in with lots of other things as well. So like, the idea of the fall and the rebellion and the
Right.
sin and choosing for yourself to eat the apple rather than just listening to what God says to you. I thought that was supposed to be the hallmark sin of autonomy, rather than trusting in the Lord,
Yeah,
whatever. And that's what it is. If it's
that's
something
right.
to do with you know, anything that deviates in any way, like any kind of creaturely, like I'm just not sure that makes sense. Like, you, or how could so? Let's say, for instance, that you're deciding which socks to put on in the morning or something. I mean, are you allowed to? Does that that's a creaturely decision, presumably, right? There's no reference to divine categories or something. You can't look that up in the Bible. You can't pray to get the answer to that or something. You have to do that on your own. But is that am I doing wrong then by I'm not sure how to
Well, so
see the other view.
I was listening to a talk that Oliphint gave where he talked about the speech that Paul gave to the philosophers.
Yeah. Right.
And the part of what he points out is that Paul quotes from various poets,
Right.
non-Jewish, non-Christian poets, various pagan poets, and then what Oliphant says is that when those poets had said those words, what they said was false. When Paul says them, what he says is true.
Yeah.
What makes for the difference? What makes for the difference is that what Paul says is in reference to the truth of Christian theism, whereas what the poets had said was with respect to the falsehoods of the of like Roman paganism or Greek paganism or whatever it was.
Yeah.
And so I take it that if you're I forget what your example was. Your example was like looking for socks or something like this.
Choosing which socks to put on in the morning.
Yeah, choosing which socks to put on. That this has to somehow be conscious of God. I mean, it's not as though they think that you're gonna like look in the Bible to figure out which socks to put on. It's not gonna be as direct as that. But in some sense, it has to be that you're conscious of God in all things, and so even in the act of putting on socks, this is still going to be an act in which you are conscious of God, subservient to God.
Well, okay. Okay. So let's. I'm just looking through my notes. I thought I had one relevant one here. I think it's okay. So in this bit where just after where he talks about Russell and descriptions, he talks about it's straight after that. It's a second. Paul also wants to make the point that blah blah blah, and I was saying it's irritating that he doesn't even meditate in any sense on what Russell said or what that's supposed to mean. But so he goes straight into talking about what Paul is saying. He goes back to talking about what Paul is saying, right?
Right.
And what he says is that second, also Paul wants to make the point that knowledge that all people have of God sufficient to render inexcusability before God is a knowledge that's true but also suppressed. Blah 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 blah. And then he ends the section off. Thus, we can at least posit here that there is, given Paul's argument, a self-evident though suppressed knowledge of God, and that this knowledge is both clearly seen and understood. And that's the end of that chapter, or end of that subsection.
That section, yeah.
Right. But so he says, given Paul's argument. What's Paul's argument? I thought. Well, let's scroll back and see if there's any mention of what Paul's argument is. I can't see that there's any argument here whatsoever, apart from Paul just says that they have this knowledge, right? And this is exactly it, I think. I mean, maybe it's in Romans, but
yeah, I mean, I've read that portion of Romans, and I don't think there's an actual argument there. I think what there is sort of an explanation.
Right. And it's the same though with the. I mean, it's a bizarre point that Oliphant's making, that Paul's right when he says it, and the Greeks are wrong. Whatever. But what Paul goes on to say in that section of Acts um, is that they all know that this God exists anyway. It picks up on their temple to the unknown God, which I take it is more a kind of insurance thing for if there's any gods that we've missed out, let's just pray to that one as well. Any ones we don't know about or something. And he's taking, oh no, that's the God, the unknown God. That's the God, the one and only God. Then you all know about him and blah blah blah. It's not. There's no unknown God. It's the known God. Something like that. Flips around and starts talking to them about how they know it all. But there is no argument for this. There's no like premise conclusion kind of argument. And it's what we get in place of an argument is a kind of flowchart thing of what to do when someone denies it, and that's, you say that they're deceiving themselves and that they do know it. You say, well, hold on, I don't think that I know. Oh, you do though. It's a subconscious denial of yourself, just like Sartre said about freedom, or just like Freud said about sexual feelings, inappropriate sexual feelings or something. You're just in self-denial about it. Well, okay, but if that's the argument, that's just like anyone, the whole, from Popper onwards, we all know the cheat codes for this type of argument, right? That it's unverifiable and you can say it about anything. Okay, so you're like the comeback, so the Freudian comeback to this type of theism is to say that, well, they're all in denial about the fact that they know that theism isn't true, and that means that when you die, it's all just oblivion, and they're trying to hide from that. That's like a key. What is it?
Yeah, I love
or something, right? That's like, and Heidegger says more or less the same sort of thing as well. It's like fear of death, which is like the reason for all of these ideologies and stuff. I mean, like, so
there's the
counterclaim on the table, right?
There's a short essay by C.S. Lewis called it's called something like this, Theology Poetry. And in that, I love juxtaposing that essay against Popper's conjectures and refutations. So, in that essay, Lewis says that he believes in God as he believes in the newly risen sun, not just because he sees it, but by its light, he sees everything else. And, when I think about that passage from Lewis, and then I think about what Popper says about, Freudian psychoanalysis, Adlerian psychoanalysis, about Marxism, about all these different systems. And it's like, well, the way in which Popper impugns all of those systems is just to say that you can interpret anything you'd like to, whatever is presented to you through his lens.
Yeah. So the problem isn't that there's no verification, it's that everything is verification.
Yeah, which is exactly what Lewis says about Christianity. That it's literally, once you become a Christian, once you convert to Christianity, you see the world through Christian lenses, and there is nothing else to see, that everything is
right. That's true. And that also happens if you believe that there's this secret cabal of international bankers who are and behind all of the history's greatest events, right? It explains everything. There's no unexplained thing. And pick your own random conspiracy theory. They're all over the internet, right? And the allure of the conspiracy theory is it's like an all-encompassing explanatory framework. So, like, that's not a hallmark of truth. It doesn't tell you that you're onto a winner here just because you can explain everything now. All of a sudden, your eyes seem like they're open and everything takes on a new significance. I mean, that's true for every balmy nutcase theory out there. Right, so all you've done is you've established that you might be one of the crazy people on the block shouting their incoherent message at one another. Right, you haven't decided, you haven't determined that you're onto a winner here. Right, so anyway, yeah, we have to start drawing this to a close because I need to get off and do some other things. So we really hardly talked that much about. I feel like if Oliphint ever saw these, he'd be really annoyed that we didn't go into more detail about what he actually said. Because you probably felt like you raised some really interesting distinctions, and
I'll have to make some next time so that we can really dig more into
Yeah. I'd been really just waiting to get through these first two sections, which is why I haven't really bothered to go into that much detail about these bits. Really, I've just sort of picked up bits that annoyed me on the way. What I want to go into is the possible world semantics stuff that he goes into, because that's where it starts getting, I don't know, interesting to me as someone who's got more of a background with modality rather than theology. But it's also where it's less up for debate whether or not what he's saying is total gibberish. So we can actually nail that down quite clearly. That there's just a lot of stuff that doesn't work at all. So yeah, next week we'll do some more. We'll be more prepared, and we'll be more of a kind of surgical inspection of the nuts and bolts of these arguments.
Fantastic.
Okay, good. So until then, yeah, we'll see you next week.
All right, I'll see you then.
Excellent.